All right. Welcome back, everyone. This is Hermit Radio. I'm your host, Cameron. Today, Dr. Joe Meyer is with me, and he teaches the program in writing and critical inquiry at the University of Albany. But he's also got quite a few other credentials that I'd love for you to go ahead and discuss with us so that kind of sets us up for our conversation today.
Sure. Cameron, first, thank you very much for having me on the show. I love it. I was just listening to your previous episode with Peter Boland. It was fantastic. Wonderful job. So my PhD, my area is early American literature with specifically connecting to biblical hermeneutics and history and narrative as well. And more recently, what I've been really kind of researching and focusing on is the role that historical movements play in how we react and move as a large body of people. So that's really what got me interested in really looking at, okay, so we kind of know where we've been. What I want to know is, where are we right now? And that led me to some really interesting questions and ideas specifically about this current movement we're in, which I didn't make up this term, but I think it really is best to call it neo-modernism.
Excellent. And that's a great place to start. And I'd love for you, could you expand on that just for anybody that's not familiar with these terms? Could you expand on that and your thoughts on it?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, what we have to understand is this is not a very specific oriented thing to talk about. In other words, you can't put a perfect date on the beginnings of these large scale historical movements. They kind of come in, and you have a recognition period somewhere around a 5, even to a 10-year mark. You start to see that the large body of people become consciously aware that we're into something else. But we like to try to put the dates as close as possible as we can to major events. Things like, in other words, people tend to say postmodernism begins after World War II. Okay, that's a convenient way to align it. But of course, you have people writing postmodern kind of texts before that a little bit, and then even after, it starts to kind of evolve into something else. What we need to know more than anything is that these major historical movements, things like the Enlightenment, Romanticism, modernism, postmodernism, and now neo-modernism, they tend to work like rubber bands. They stretch and stretch and stretch. And then what ends up happening is, as you're stretching it, you're building up this potential energy that eventually has to snap. And as anyone who's played with rubber bands before, you know that snap is not soft. It's actually quite violent in a lot of ways. And that's why I think we end up toward the tail end of these movements with things like war or major civil unrest, because I think that's the snapping of the rubber band. Neo-modernism is in many ways a reaction to the complexity of postmodernism, what we just left behind. Now, this is where things can get a little bit weird, because postmodernism is weird for the sake of being weird. You can sum up postmodernism basically in one word. It's about skepticism. It's skeptical of things like meta-narratives or any kind of grand narrative that attempts to say this is the way something is, and that's it. It will always push back against that. The problem is, by the tail end of postmodernism, it puts so much skepticism on narrative, on belief, on what we might call capital T truth, that I think society starts to become a little bit lost. And I'll just give you a quick example of what I mean here. And this is not meant to shame people, right? I have to say this because it's a really odd moment, but it was a wake-up moment for me. I'm sure, are you familiar with the show Family Guy?
Yes.
Okay, yep. Most people are, right? Even if they don't like it, they know of it. Okay, there's a character on Family Guy named Herbert. And if you're familiar with the show, you know Herbert has an additional part to his name. Yes. His name is Herbert the Pervert. Now, there's a scene in one of the episodes with Herbert where he is tucking in Peter's son, Chris. And it's this awkward, tense moment. Chris is about, I want to say 15 or so. Even that is awkward to a degree, but that's not where the tense moment comes from. It's because the audience knows that Herbert likes boys. Okay. At the end of Herbert reading this story to Chris, there's this moment of silence, and then Chris just blurts out, "Are you a pedophile?" And everyone, I've shown this scene to my students, and they burst out laughing. Now, pause there. Pause. I'm not saying what I'm about to say to shame. What I want to point out is simply that postmodernism broke down our narrative so much that whether we want to believe it or not, we laughed at a pedophile joke. Again, look, I like Family Guy. I laugh at it. I think it's funny. My only point is that is what postmodernism, or that is what historical movements can do to us. It broke that down so much that we actually laughed at that.
You know, you touched on something really important here. And when I hear you saying that, what I thought of is that that's not funny. And then you said your students laughed at it, which that's why I had that aha moment, because I was like, wow. You know, man, I really hate to even bring this up, but I feel like since we're already talking about it, I feel like I need to bring it up. Did you see, have you heard or seen that professor, and I forget, I'm completely ignorant of it, but there's a professor who just wrote a book basically trying to remove the stereotypes of pedophiles by saying that we shouldn't call them pedophiles because it's offensive, and we should call them minor attracted persons. They wrote a book about this, and they were on, yes, I'm now that we're talking about it, I'm going to have to pull it up on my phone. So give me a minute.
Sure. Yeah, please.
But yeah, it was controversial. The university suspended them, and it was a big deal. And a lot of people were outraged by it. And I myself, like, I was talking about this in my circles with people because I was shocked. I was shocked because this person was being interviewed for a podcast to talk about their new book. And that was the whole premise of their conversation, was this idea that calling pedophiles is hurtful. And so we shouldn't do that because we live in this age where we shouldn't offend people. But it's been taken that far. And, you know, I listen, I get it. I understand the want and the need to not be offensive. But again, at what point is it too far, right? Like, now that if we call this person a minor attracted person, does that mean that it's no longer wrong? Does that still mean that it's not a crime to be attracted to children and to have this thing going on, right? Like, at what point has it gone too far? And I feel like that's kind of where I wanted to go with that after you brought that point up. And I want you to go ahead and touch on that. And I'm listening while I'm trying to find this thing for you.
Yeah, so I like this, Cameron. Let's get into this. Let's do this. So what you're talking about here is the battle that is taking place every day between postmodern complexity, right? Where I want to, postmodern thinking tends to say, I want to push back against labels. Okay, I don't want your label, you know, none of that stuff. And not all stories are 100% believable or true or should be taken as the truth. What
Right.
you have there, in my opinion, is an author who is very much writing a postmodern book saying this label of pedophile, let's deconstruct it and let's get rid of it. And instead, let's put something else there. And then the people who are upset about it, they're trying to work toward, I think, a neo-modern mindset, which is reacting to that postmodern yearning for complexity and to reject labels. There are, and we can get into this too later on as well, I see three main issues that we're struggling with in neo-modernism. The first one, and I think this plays a role in what you just brought up, is we're looking for narrative reassurance. So instead of deconstructing and pushing back against all narratives, which is what postmodernism itself kind of crumbled into by the end, neo-modern people are saying, no, 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 we want narrative assurance now. We want to highlight something, say what it is, give it a label, but we want to own what that label is in some ways. We want to control it. The second thing that I see is people in neo-modernism are looking to transcend the body. And all I mean by that is they're looking for ways to explore a higher narrative than just where we are. So, for example, you're hearing, you can't avoid the influx of conversations around meditation, prayer, psychedelics. All of that is because people are hungry to be something more than just this mortal material world at this point. Because postmodernism was all about commercialization, materials. It was all about deconstructing those materials to find out what they're doing, to us and to each other. And so we're looking for ways to get beyond that. The third thing is that we're looking for ways to create sacred spaces, places that are important to us that we no longer want to be mocked. We're not inviting mockery, right? Postmodernism, again, at the end, what is it doing in that scene that I just mentioned? It is kind of mocking a really serious problem. But postmodernism uses comedy to infiltrate those areas and kind of deconstruct them into a level of, I'll say mockery again, because I can't really think of a better word at this point. It is mocking that issue, and not to mock it as if, I'm sure if you had Seth MacFarlane here, he would say, I'm not proposing that we should make that normal. Rather, I'm trying to expose something awkward. I'm trying to build tension and then release it through the laughter. Now, what you're talking about is, I think, falls into that category of all three of those, where this postmodern author is hitting upon trying to destabilize a narrative of what you said, kind of good and evil. Neo-modernism is about, can we get back to simplicity of good and evil and believe that that exists? And what the author did is push back against that, and against even the creation of a sacred space to say, this is wrong. Right. I don't want to give this another label. I don't want that postmodern idea. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And so I found it, I had to, it took me too long to scroll on Twitter to go to the exact thing, but this is from American News. This was published November 16th. The controversy over Dr. Walker's research has disrupted the campus and community environment and is interfering with the institution's mission of teaching and learning. And that's, I think that this was a statement for why the professor was placed on leave. And I'll do some more research later on to kind of like figure out whether that person is still on leave or not. But so, and I'm glad we brought this up, because I think about this kind of thing all the time. And are you familiar with Dr. Jordan Peterson?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is something that got him into hot water a few years back, right? Not so much about pedophilia, but more about people's pronouns and things like that. And he got in trouble because he drew a line in the sand and said, I'm not going to allow the government to tell me that at my job, I'm going to call somebody by their pronouns, right? I think, people got really offended by that. But again, I think that they don't understand what his point of view was. And it's not that he was trying to be offensive to anyone, but he was trying to say, like, how far is too far, right? At what point, and I'm not trying to be offensive, but I think for most people that don't understand this idea that's happening, it's like, okay, at what point does identity become like, at what point can I say I identify as a starfish? And then at what point is that acceptable and okay? And it's like, and if that is, then why not anything else, right? Like, why have any rules? Why have any laws? Why not just identify as a starfish and everybody can be what they want? Everybody can believe what they want, and, see how that goes for society. But I think that this goes into what you're talking about, is that these, the rubber band expanding. And I've heard several different people now talk about this idea that, large societies, when they're about to collapse, it's usually when there is this evolution of equality between genders, and when they start to see the roles reversing from the masculine side of things, where men are dominating, these leadership roles and academics and everything. When they start to see a reversal of that, when it starts to become more women in charge, and it's not because women are ruining things, that's not what I'm saying, but it's this movement that when it's almost like a displacement or a confusion. And when that takes place, these societies collapse. And it's not one, there are several academic studies that have been shown that at the height, at the pinnacle of these civilizations, when things start to turn is when these things like what you're talking about, this rubber band is expanded so far, it snaps. And then the repercussion is that the society collapses on itself. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, here's the good news that I will say about this. I'm studying these historical movements. I don't see a collapse in society. What I see is the same things that we've always had, which is that eventually it ends up being like a pendulum to a degree that keeps swinging, and then it will, when the real snap happens, which it hasn't happened yet, we still have probably at least another 10, 15 years or so in neo-modernism trying to work this stuff out, which is probably bad news, because neo-modernism connects back to modernism, which is the movement just before postmodernism. And and modernism was not a particularly wonderful time to live. You have the panic, you have World War I, you have a tremendous amount of strife and horror, mixed in with the occasional sub movement of like the flapper age and things like that. What I see happening here is when that snaps, I think postmodernism is a kind of peak in these movements, and we're coming back down, I think. And so we're hitting up neo-modernism, and I think after that we're going to end up in a neo-romanticism as well. And in neo-romanticism, I think you're going to see a turning back toward nature, back toward a relationship with some kind of divine order of things, because that was a tremendous amount of focus on romanticism. But it'll be new in a new way, right? Because even with these turns toward meditation and prayer, I think people are probably going to reach a certain point where they're going to say that's not enough for me now. And that's why I think you're going to end up in neo-romanticism and a move toward whatever specific religion you want to. I think people are going to dive into institutionalized religion at that point as a means of making even a harder connection to something beyond us, what we are. But
Yes.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
absolutely. No, it makes me think of the it makes me think of transcendentalism.
Exactly.
In the early stages or the early years of the American, of the American society or colony society, whatever you want to call it, the Enlightenment phase. It's very much the same thing. And they called that the Great Awakening and then the Second Great Awakening. I think we're in the Third Great Awakening. And some people in, spiritual communities, they think that that is something like this big spiritual movement that's, I don't think it's that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we are going through a cultural revolution. And there are lots of keys to that. You brought up a good point, which is this idea of meditation. There are lots of people turning away from religious dogma to this idea of spiritualness, which doesn't have an identity per se. It's not one, thing. It's not like, even if they're a spiritual person, they're not just saying I'm a Buddhist, they're turning away from that in general. They're saying I'm a spiritual person. And that can be anything. Again, it's like this idea of like without having boundaries. And I think that those people in this category, right? And I'm one of those people. I've always had a hard time with religious dogma, and I love the idea of being a spiritual person versus a religious person. But I've had to kind of think about what that means for me, and what does that mean? What do I believe? What are my virtues? What gives me meaning in life? And I've had to pull from all of the different religions, the Stoics, the philosophers, to kind of create my own thing, because I think meaning is what we make it, right? Our purpose in life is whatever we give it. Whatever we want it to be, that's what it is. And we don't have to have any of these institutions anymore. We can make our own institutions. And I think that that is in the essence what this next great awakening is, because it's not just about religion. It's about media. It's about, the industry, pharmaceuticals, all of it. I think people have just had enough. I think people just are collectively realizing that things have worked in our country, or maybe even in the world, for so long because it was a fine-tuned machine and everybody was just kind of doing their thing until it stopped working. And it's not that the machine's not working, it's just that the people working on the machine, the people operating the machine, they're like, this isn't good. I don't like this anymore.
Yeah, and I want to point out something here too, right? What you said, you just kind of really went into a very neo-modern ethos here, because not only did you have a kind of force of belief behind what you were saying, right? But you didn't have complexity. There was no real complexity to what you said. You
Right.
very clearly articulated, I need this, right? But then the neo-modern part too is you're building a narrative reassurance by pulling in whatever you want to use to give yourself stability.
Right.
Whereas the postmodern ethos would say, no, 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 you don't want stability. You want to keep deconstructing it. Eventually you get to a point where you deconstruct to like an atom, and then you stare at the atom and go, what the heck do I do with this? Right?
Yeah.
That's again the problem, the tail end of postmodernism. You deconstruct so much that as a whole, society looks at it and goes, well, now what do we do with this? So what happens in neo-modernism? We build it back up. And we build up this narrative reassurance. Now, to be fair, though, I want to press you here a little bit, right? So you have the neo-modern ethos, right? And I think you represent quite a large swath of humanity in the way you talk about that. My story, my narrative, my built up, ideal. How do you see that eventually snapping when we get to the tail end of neo-modernism?
Yeah. I think that what is happening is there are so many people that because what is it that we want, right? We want to be free. But what does it mean to be free, right? Do I mean free in the sense of America in the early 2000s, right? Where it's like you're kind of free, but you're not really free, right? Like, I think people want to be truly free. I don't think people want to pay taxes. I don't think people want to work if they don't want to. And I think that that is expanding. And I don't know that it'll go that far. I don't know that society could survive if we went to something to that extreme. But I think that there are a lot of people who want that. And for myself, what I've had to do in place of that, right? Because that's a big thing. I've had to bring it back down to just my personal self. I want to live by virtues, and that's good enough. Whatever the rest of the world is going to do, it's long for me. If I keep my virtues, which is, I want to be a good person. I want to keep bettering myself. I want to be open-minded, and I want to help the world be a better place, and whatever that means. That's okay for me, but that doesn't necessarily get to what you're saying, which is, what is the rest of the world going to do? I don't know. Me personally, I don't think it looks good. I think that there's a lot of, as you were talking about this idea of deconstructing, I think that that's happening. I think that people are figuring out that the way that we do business in the world, it's not adequate. You kind of alluded to something to that earlier in the conversation, where you said, when we break it down all the way down to the atom, we look at it and we're like, man, what do we do with this now? I think that that's what we're doing right now. I think that, like, in our government and our politics, because let's like look at that, let's look at that with a perspective of just you and me having a conversation, right? I feel like most people would agree that our politics, they don't work. Why don't they work? Because it's two-sided, and one side doesn't like the other side, right? Vice versa. And they're doing whatever they can to derail the other one. So it's not working in conjunction with each other, right? I don't care what anybody says. If you're a Democrat, you're in the position that you hate Republicans. And if you're a Republican, you're in the position that you hate Democrats. And what we've seen in the last two administrations was that when Trump was president, all the Democrats did everything they could to stonewall him and to keep him from passing legislation, to keep him from doing what he wanted to do. And now we're seeing the exact same thing happen with Biden as president. The Republicans are doing everything they can to keep him from passing legislation, to derail what he wants to do. Is that working? Is that government style working for us? I don't think so.
Well, yeah, now you're touching upon something else that I've looked into. Chantal Mouffe has a wonderful book. I'm going to get the title wrong. People can look it up. I think it's either the Democratic Paradox or the Paradox of Democracy. And I think it was in 2006 she came out with the book. And what that book talks about is that you need antagonism in a democratic system, because you need the pushing of each other to create, let's call it like a Rousseauian general will, right? But
Yes.
Here's the problem that you touched upon. I'm thinking of this almost like a Google map. If you look on a local level and you're just standing there with Republicans and Democrats, everything looks very different, right? This tree looks different than that tree. There's a rock that looks different from a house. Everything looks completely different. But when you zoom out and you telescope out, everything merges together into a kind of blob that looks the same. And this is what I think the angst that people are feeling about our current state of politics is, because we're zooming out and we're starting to realize, oh boy, these things at the end of the day, they look a little bit too much alike, actually, not because they have different. I'm not one of those people who says that a Republican is the same thing as a Democrat and vice versa. Right. No. Right. But what we're keying in on is that the tactics being used are the same. And because of that, they look very much alike, and it feels like we don't have much of a choice. And I think that's the difference here between what Chantal Mouffe talks about, that you need antagonism, which you do, and needing and what we have, which is just simply how do we perform, let's say, Republican or Democrat.
Yeah, no, well said, well said. And when you're saying antagonism, I think for me, the word that comes to my mind is more, in layman's terms, competition, right? That's always what's been the keystone in America, or the United States anyways, in Western culture. That's what has helped us pervade and helped us grow. And I don't know that I may be overreaching by saying that, at one point it was healthy, right? And it was a healthy competition to kind of get us better, right? Like I feel like there is such a thing as healthy competition. But I don't think that that's where we are now. I don't think that because healthy competition is, let's think about sports, right? Good sportsmanship. You want to win, but at the end of the day, you're going to shake the other person's hand and be like, all right, you won, I'll do better next time, right? That takes virtue. That takes morality. And arguably, that is what we don't have, right? Because one side of our political argument, they're not doing that. They're not shaking each other's hands. They're saying, fuck you. You guys suck. You're a communist. No, you're a fascist, right? You're a racist. No, you're a racist, right? And it just keeps escalating, right? And it's like, I've noticed now, everybody wants to say, like, at least from one side of the argument, they want to call the term conspiracy theory has become taboo, right? And words have become weapons, right? What I see is that when one side of an argument doesn't like what the other one says, it becomes very easy to say, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. You're a racist, right? Even though that is completely unfounded and more than likely not true. But because, and this is what I've seen, there's no longer a good debate, right? People do not know how to communicate with each other anymore, because the people are so fed up with themselves and with each other that as soon as a conversation goes in a direction that they don't like, you're a racist, you're sexist, you're whatever, right? It's because the conversation has now ended. They don't want to continue the conversation. They just want to say what they think and to be right and to not be challenged. And it's not one side, both sides are doing it. Do you notice that both sides, and I'm only speaking for the United States, both sides, Democrat and Republican in Congress, they're calling each other pedophiles. You notice this, that this idea, this conspiracy that there are pedophiles in our government that are running things, right? people on both sides, they're calling each other pedophiles, right? And it's like, for me, it's like, I don't know that they even believe that that's true. I think that they just want to say the most hurtful, degrading thing they can to end the argument, much like children, right? It's like children. I have a 12-year-old stepson right now, and I noticed that when he gets upset, he says the most hurtful thing he can to end the conversation. And it is in children to do this, but I also notice that adults do this too when the limit of conversation has been reached.
Yeah, and this I would also say falls under the problem of neo-modernism,
Yes.
because you have what I would, at this point at least, call a compression of language issue. And this, I think, even connects back, if you want, to what Orwell talks about in 1954 in The Politics and the English Language, where he says that back then, he says, because our language has become lazy, our thoughts have become lazy. The problem with what you're talking about rhetorically is that compression of language into one word,
Right.
to just throw out there, immediately does there's so much connotative baggage now connected to every word that it does kind of inhibit and stop any sort of meaningful discussion. And it's not that we've never had that before. We have had it. It's just in a context for today, it is specifically used to shut down a conversation.
Right.
The conspiracy theory thing, I talked about this with my students. We actually had a lesson about this. We broke down, so what exactly is going on here, that there is such an uptick in both the use of the word and in the power of these. And what we came away with was a kind of a thing that you need to begin with at least some kind of factual truth. And whatever that is, that factual truth that you begin with is the thing that you're always able to point back to verify the rest of your narrative. No matter how far it spins out of control, you can always point back to that original truth. So in my class, we talked about the Illuminati. And I actually gave my students a letter from George Washington.
Yes.
And I had them transcribe it in class. I said, I want you to transcribe this letter. And they're transcribing the letter, and they get to the word Illuminati, and they don't quite know what it is. They're like, I don't know what it is. It's illuminate. He's saying illuminate. And I said, no. He's expressing a concern about the Illuminati, right? And they look at me like, uh-oh, we're going to go into conspiracy theory land. And I said, no. What I want to show you is that there is a truth. There is a factual element here behind the word. And I even talked with them about the history of it, which comes out of Masonry, Freemasonry. But then the Illuminati as a movement within Freemasonry is essentially shut down at a certain point. Maybe it only lasts about 100 years or something like that. It's shut down. And there's no real, as far as we can tell, evidence of this kind of organization that's still doing these things, right? But can you always point back to that truthful element? Of course you can. And that's enough for people to, and here's the neo-modern part, to create and reassure their narrative that this must be it. This is how it's happening. And so this influx in conspiracy theory belief and even yearning for comes out of, I want to reassure a narrative and I want to be able to stand on it. And in order to do that, though, you have to deconstruct all the surrounding narratives as well, so that your one narrative can stand up tall. And so what I see, again, I'm not looking at this from a historical perspective, is very unsexy, because you can't go into extremes. The historical perspective here of the movements simply looks at what is happening and trying to figure out what are the elements that got us here. So I'm not even interested in trying to debunk or give value to any theories or conspiracy theories. I simply want to show that there is a reason for why this seems to be heightened right now. And let's not forget, too, something else that I had a student who wrote a wonderful paper on, actually, was this influx in crime, true crime podcasts, right? Or true crime shows, murders. People are interested in serial killers, stuff like that. Why? because they're interested in the compelling narrative, and they're interested, I think, in trying to figure out what is making them different from me.
Right. Or can I become that? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Is to think about, I want to learn that narrative, because then even if they want to do it subconsciously, they want to put it up against themselves and see where the differences are. Where can I merge with that and become something horrifying?
Yes. Absolutely. Well, and so I was talking with man, I forget who it was. Oh, Professor Peter Bolin, in my last podcast. We talked about conspiracy theories. And, I mean, the term itself, I feel like it's taboo for a reason, right? Now, the fact that it is taboo can be good, as in keeping people from chasing things that are dangerous, but then at the same time, it might keep you from looking into something that actually needs to be looked into. And the one thing I always tell people to look back on is Jeffrey Epstein, right? Like, I really find it troubling that people are so against conspiracy theories, but then you have something like Jeffrey Epstein, and you have all the people that he's connected to and all of the things that have happened. You can watch any number of documentaries now. And, people like Alex Jones, they were talking about Jeffrey Epstein in the early 2000s before he was even on anyone's radar. Nobody gives Alex Jones any credit for that. And I'm not a big fan of Alex Jones anyways, but I'm just saying that, like, I think that we are losing the ability to question things that should be questioned. If we just throw it all out and say, like, we can't talk about conspiracies, it's too dangerous, then we'll never be able to question anything, and we'll never be able to really know that there are truly messed up things happening, and there are people in power, unfortunately. Again, in another good example is the Cuomo brothers, right? Look at what happened with Andrew Cuomo and Chris Cuomo. That is just a mess. And of course that's not as dangerous of a conspiracy theory, but if nobody wanted to challenge that, if nobody challenged these two people and looked into what they were doing, we would have never known, and they would have kept doing what they were doing. And it's a slippery slope. It sucks that that's the world we live in right now, but I just feel like I understand that conspiracies like QAnon can be dangerous, certainly. But if we don't question people like the Cuomo brothers, then that behavior will carry on, or Jeffrey Epstein for that matter. It'll carry on, And it's like, how can you not question? How can you not think something's up? Look at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. A trial that should have taken easily 6 weeks has been reduced down to 2 weeks, and hardly really any evidence has been put forth. It's been a very weak trial in my opinion, and there's a chance that she could walk. And it's like, how is somebody that is so dangerous, that is really connected with one of the worst people in our history as a country, there's a chance she might walk just because of our court systems. It makes you wonder, and I see that why there is an appeal towards conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and again, I would say that this highlights that the problem of the compression of language, where we reduce everything to a soundbite, or reduce it to, I mean, you can make the joke, of course, you reduce it to a tweet.
Yeah.
In that way, right? And so I didn't even think about this until now. You might, of course, say that the one led to the other, right? That there's definitely a connection between the compression of social media creation, social media language, to our current inability or current yearning to compress language to the point that you can't, now we're out of postmodernism. You can't deconstruct it really methodically, or at least, yeah, I should say it that way. We're not deconstructing it, at least methodically, like they tried to do in postmodernism to create meaning. You're deconstructing the word into chaos. It just becomes nothingness, really. Yes. More than anything else. Yeah, I think it does kind of come back to that idea that the words have been deconstructed so much into chaos that now we don't even know necessarily what to do with it. I've been in situations before where and I make a joke about this, but I'm talking to someone, and then about halfway through the conversation, I realize, oh, I'm in a debate.
Mm,
I didn't even know it, and I'm losing. Like, what just happened? You know, we come back to this. You mentioned before, kind of weaponizing language,
yes.
and I definitely see today, rather than discussing or talking about something, we tend to have debates and debates only, but not debate in the traditional sense, as in you're trying to propose something and at the same
Yes.
time trying to learn something so that you can come to, let's call it a Rousseauian general will consensus. We're not really interested in, and this is that neo-modern issue that I was getting to before, we're so far into our own individual narratives that we must defend because they become our sacred space, that we're not really listening to each other. All we're
Yes.
doing is we're trying to look for ways that we can prop up our narrative and deconstruct or collapse the other person's.
Yeah, it's become a fist fight, right? Like conversations have become fist fights, not conversations. And I see this all the time. And I think that there are a couple points that I'd like to highlight about why this is. I don't know how we got here, but what I notice is that when I'm talking to people, you mentioned something important, which is number one, that people are not listening to each other, right? When you're talking to somebody, this is another aspect of the mind, right? Like this is something that the mind is doing, and it's a trick, right? You're playing, it's conversations today are like playing chess. You're not listening to the other person. Your ears do hear the words, but in your mind, you're thinking about, what am I going to say next, right? What piece of evidence can I pull? And you're doing that in your mind while not listening to what the other person's saying. And again, I notice this. Children are a really good case study for this because, and again, my 12-year-old stepson, what I notice when he gets frustrated, when he gets into this really heightened state of emotion, when we're talking, he repeats himself, and I'll say what he's asking. He'll be like, well, I don't understand. I'll explain it to him. And then when I'm done explaining, he'll immediately come back with, but I don't understand why. It's because he's not listening, because he's working on his narrative, right? And that, even though that's happening with a 12-year-old, that is happening with adults right now. Adults are no more advanced, at least not, I don't want to generalize. Some adults are not on a thinking level much higher than children. And, you could argue that this is like a trauma response, right? Like this is how they learned how to handle these things. It's just like lying. When you're a child, you learn that lying gets you out of trouble. And that's why lying continues on into adulthood. You learn that if I lie and get out of the situation, then boom. Like I've recognized that in relationships. I've caught people in the act of lying. And when I call them out on it, they just laugh and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, you got me. And I'm like, no, like you need to realize you're lying because you know you're wrong and you're just trying to get out of trouble. You're trying to get out of the conversation. That's not okay. But nobody's ever said that, right? And now when we get into these more advanced conversations, when we're talking about, we're talking about gender, or we're talking about pedophilia, or we're talking about where our government's going, politics, that is still happening in those conversations. And so that's the first point. The second point, what I'm realizing more and more is that people are willing to talk about a lot of things that they have no business talking on because they have no idea what they're talking about, right? Like it's one thing to talk about video games because you have experience in playing video games. It's entirely different to talk about politics when you've never read a book or had any formal education or anything. The only thing you know about politics is what you watch on Fox News or CNN. And that doesn't mean that you're educated in it. It just means that you're repeating what someone else is saying.
Yeah, now you're getting into sort of the ancient Greek take on democracy, right? The problem with pure democracies is that you have to rely on an educated populace to be able to make an educated vote. Now, I prefer, I know there's been some push toward trying to make the United States like a pure democracy, but I actually respect the republic part of this. I think that's still the better form of democracy, a democratic republic. But yes, you are highlighting in our age, especially, how you can turn someone's political belief or leaning with a thumbnail, right? So the creation of the YouTube thumbnail is actually quite fascinating because you could have the most wonderful intellectual great, conversation among two public intellectuals that are wonderful, but the thumbnail will still have to be something like so and so destroys blank. And it's kind of like, no, that doesn't happen at all in
Right.
it. But our new digital age of communication, we're training ourselves, and we've been training ourselves to look for the moments of so and so destroyed this other person. And so, like you said, we end up in a kind of place that's yearning for the war of discussion.
Yes.
Or the chess, like you said before. And that is incredibly problematic. I mean, that's really problematic because, like you said, it means we're not, even if we are listening, what we're listening for is the drama, the dramatic turn, and not what is actually being said. Not so much policy, but who can win. Think about even in the last election. In the last election, during the Democratic debate, the talk was about Tulsi Gabbard destroying Vice President Kamala Harris. That was the big story, not what they said,
Right.
not the policy, not
The
what
narrative.
they're standing on, the narrative. It was a thumbnail.
Yes.
Tulsi Gabbard destroys now Vice President Kamala Harris. What do we learn from that? Nothing.
No.
We've learned nothing, but that is the soundbite. That's the thumbnail that we take away from the conversation. And eventually, which we will, by the way, because again, when you look at the historical movement part of this, you know that eventually this rubber band, which is still being pulled back, is going to snap. And it's not going to snap into chaos. It's going to snap just into where we need to readjust ourselves. That's it. So we'll be okay. And like I said, it's more likely that we're going to end up snapping into a kind of neo-romanticism, I think, more than anything else, which might actually be quite good for us.
Yeah, I love that. I think that was a really wonderful thing that you just said there. So many good points. And again, I think you touched on one of the main things, which is that, like, the thumbnail thing, right? Like, why do people do that? They don't want to know what was in the conversation. They just want to see Tulsi Gabbard destroy Kamala Harris, right? Which that in itself is a bias, right? And this is something that I have been working with because, in the age of COVID, there are doctors and scientists who are on one side of the argument, and there are doctors and scientists on the other side. And so I asked a good friend of mine who's very intelligent, I said, is science biased? And he said, no, of course not. But I heard somebody really put this into a really good term this morning. When people say trust the science, there is no such thing as the science. There is science. Science is testing, hypothesis, and the ability to create something, to test it, to see if it works. That is what science is. Using this thing like trust the science, that's not a good way of saying it, because what you're saying is trust my narrative. And I don't think that that's a good use of these words. Again, it's using words. It's not about the science. It's trust my narrative. Trust what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is more important or more believable than what you're saying. And I think that this is what has caused so much so many problems in our more recent age, especially with COVID, is that people are using the language, like you said. It's like we're all still speaking English, but we're speaking two different dialects of English, right? There is this one dialect of English, and then this other one. And this one says, trust, science, and trust these doctors, and trust these medical professions. And then there's the other one that says, I don't trust them. I don't like them. I don't believe them. And here are these other doctors and scientists who say that what they're saying is bullshit. And what that basically has come down to is, now, again, what I was talking about with our politics, is that nobody is actually working towards a goal. They're working towards fighting each other. And I think that that's the problem. But I like what you said. You brought up a really optimistic point of view, which is that you think that the rubber band snapping is going to lead into a romanticism. And you know what? I want to believe that, and I'm going to adopt that thought now that you've said it, because I love that. And when you look back at history, this isn't the first time we faced challenges, the human race, right? This isn't the end of us. This will turn into something else, right? Revolutions are not always bloody. Sometimes they are done through ideas and thoughts, and maybe that's what we're dealing with now. I think the most important thing for us to remember, or that we can do to better this thing, is two parts, and that is to educate ourselves. In this day and age, I am less inclined to watch somebody's YouTube video to learn something about whatever the topic is. I'm more inclined now to go do my own research, to go read medical journals, to go read peer-reviewed studies, to read books, because what I'm learning is that a lot of people in my circles are talking about things with no information at all, no education, no nothing. They're just saying whatever they heard on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, whatever. I don't want to be that person. I need to educate myself, and I need to understand these things from intellectual places in institutions, because that is how it was done in the past. And that's why we're in the mess we're in. We're farther away from that. And we touched on that with this idea that our society needs to be intellectual to make informed decisions. I tend to agree with that. And I think that we're living in a time where we rely so much on this thing that we're not educating ourselves, right? Like, why educate yourself when you can Google what you need to know and have that at the, at your hand in 5 seconds. So that has kind of reduced us to not even wanting to learn. It's like, why? I got this. There's no need to read a book when I can just Google the answer. So I think that that's one part. The second part is we need to learn how to talk to each other again. Talk to each other by listening and by being open-minded enough to accept that maybe we can be wrong and that someone else might know something that we don't.
Yeah, and you don't have to be, something we've lost is you don't have to be on a side. You don't have to be.
Right.
I love being in the middle, honestly, and just thinking that it's, oh yeah, you make a good point here, and you make a good point too. I'm going to take from both of that and put it into myself and say, this is how I'm going to balance myself out, is to say, yeah, both sides have certain great points and certain terrible points. And the importance for the individual is to take from any side that has a good discussion and not feel the need to defend any one side. I mean, this idea that we have to in some way be on one side or the other is ludicrous. It's ridiculous, quite honestly. There's no need for it. And it shows when you go back to the early Enlightenment part of this, right? You've got David Hume talking about making a good point for us today, which is, believing that the human being tends to be run on emotions or passions more than anything. We're seeing a lot of that. But by the end of the Enlightenment moving into Romanticism, you've got Rousseau making this great argument that in a democracy, in a social contract, you have to come to some kind of general consensus, a general will, which means that you and I, if we were going to discuss something, edgy, which we've discussed some things here today, but our goal in a Rousseauian way would be to come to some kind of consensus that we can both live by. That doesn't mean you're going to get what you want. It doesn't mean I'm going to get what I want. We're both going to lose something. And we both have to be okay with that. It just seems, but that's a middle area that doesn't get clicks, right? Here's a thumbnail for you that I already know will fail. Interesting argument had. No one is going, but if you make a thumbnail, college professor is destroyed, right? Higher education fails yet again, right? You make that, you'll get the clicks, right? You'll get the clicks. And at the end too, most of the people will leave the video and go, wait, what happened? Never mind. They'll move past it. They won't even challenge the thumbnail. They'll just kind of go, okay, whatever. So yeah, I mean, I think moving toward a general will, I think we're going to end neo-modernism with a kind of Rousseauian move. Why? Because we have to. History does not care, Cameron, about you or me. It doesn't care that you really want this to happen or I really want this to happen. All that is going to happen is history is going to keep pushing us and ushering us forward. And by the end of all this, we will have to come to some kind of sense of a general will on certain things. And so what I'm optimistic about, what I see is less contentious discussion about these things today. Of course, in neo-romanticism, I'll likely be dead by then. It's fine. But I see less contentiousness. I see a returning toward trying to value what is outside of us, something that is greater than us. And so for the people who are really worried about things like climate change and stuff, let me tell you something that will likely be addressed more in neo-romanticism than it will be in neo-modernism. Maybe that's bad news for them, but good news, because in romanticism, you have a return to valuing nature.
Mm. Yeah.
And so, and understanding kind of that the beauty of it and the ideas of its grandeur, what it does for us, you know, all of that stuff. I see climate change probably getting addressed in neo-romanticism, along with a return, like I said, to I think a more move toward institutionalized religion.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And to caveat to that, you say religion. I want to throw out there spiritualism.
I'm going to push back.
Go ahead, push
I'm
it.
going to push back, because spiritualism is now. That's now.
Yes.
And we believe it to be 100% true that we need the meditation. You know, I've talked to people who say that they pray, and what they're doing actually is meditating. And you can have meditative prayer, of course.
Yes.
But at the end of it, this has nothing to do with how we're feeling right now individually. At the end of that, though, I think you're going to find people moving toward institutionalized religion, because they're going to be yearning for a narrative that now they don't have to create.
Yes.
That narrative is there, right? Whether it's any of the Abrahamic religions, Hinduism, you know, even philosophies that are like religions, but that are established, you're going to have movements toward those because of I'll say in a clumsy way, kind of an extra level of stability, right? Beyond even just what you and I can create for ourselves. Because when you were talking about you create your own values, right? You notice now too that everybody is super into Nietzsche, right?
Yes.
Everybody loves talking about Nietzsche. Okay, guess what? That's a neo-modern thing, right?
Yeah.
Because what is Nietzsche famous for? He's the man who declared God's dead.
Yes.
Right? So people are returning to that idea. And of course, Nietzsche, what do you have to supplant God with? You have to construct your own value system.
Yes.
Let me tell you something, Cameron, that is not easy to do.
No.
Because sorry, I was just to end it. You get pushback all the time, and especially today. Anytime you log on to a social media platform, you read something, you get pushback against your value system. And Nietzsche, I don't think Nietzsche makes that move if he's around today. I don't, precisely because of social media and the influx of information.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you said something important there, which is that, you know, orchestrating your own virtues, your own morality is difficult, right? And I agree with that. Like, I'm a living example of this. I grew up not religious at all, completely atheist. I was in the military for most of my adult life, and that only cemented in the fact that I was not a religious person. But when I got out of the Army, I did psychedelics, and that gave you, yes, there you go, you're on it. That gave me some experiences that made me believe in something more, but I had to figure out what that was. And I kind of went through this phase where I started reading about Buddhism, but then I read about all the religions, because I'm like, okay, there's something in all of them that is unique and beautiful, and I love all of them. But what I found out was that I couldn't relate. I couldn't relate to any one of them specifically, because as much as I love Buddhism, I don't believe that we should renounce things. I don't think that it's as much about giving things up as it is about learning how to deal with them through the mind. And I found myself in this place between Buddhism and Stoicism, because Stoicism is great, but you have to have a reason to want to do that, which is where I like Buddhism, because Buddhism isn't about a God. It's just about understanding your mind. It's about understanding this universe that is around us. And so that's kind of where I fall into place, is somewhere in between there. But what I had to do is, once I found myself in the middle and not in either one of those categories, that meant I had to establish my own rules, my own laws for living. But what happened? Why did that happen to me? Because I had traumatic life experiences, and I did psychedelics. And that opened my mind to doing something different. Not everybody's there yet. But I think that this is what you're alluding to, is that that's where we're heading, is people doing things like that. Am I right on that?
I think so. And I don't want to undervalue either the end result of this, right? Because if we're going to let's get truthful here for a second. The human being it's very difficult to try to balance oneself, build your narrative, and then truly stand by it, right? Because like I said, you are tested all the time, right? Even just our conversation, we're tested, right? And you tend to find, or the human being tends to find him or herself in a space where you have to move left and right a little bit constantly. Now, what does it mean then if the human being is constantly establishing these, I think what Nietzsche would call, and this I'll use this metaphor because it's a perfect metaphor. Nietzsche on Truth and Lying, he gives this metaphor of the cobweb. And he says the cobweb, it has to be strong enough that it can hold your value system. And yet what happens when a strong wind comes by? Just blows it away. And you have to reconstruct it. Okay. So you construct your value system, your story, but you're constantly having to move left and right to adjust. What eventually is going to happen, and this is the snapping point at the end. How long can an individual live in that place where you work so hard to establish this value system that you want nothing more than to be the bedrock of your existence, and yet you're constantly still making little moves left and right? What eventually is going to happen?
Yeah.
You're going to go crazy.
Yes.
Because you're going to realize, you know what? I have no stability, actually. I don't really. And that's going to create a true existential crisis of meaning, where you say, and I don't mean you personally, I mean the you in general. You say, I don't know if I'm strong enough to actually do this. And that's why I say neo-romanticism is going to be people moving toward institutionalized religion, because you're going to say, I've got to let something else do this. I've got to let something else that I can believe in, that can withstand the movement back and forth. It might seem to some to be, no way we're going back to puritanical things. There's no possible way. I'm calling it. I'm calling it. Not to that level, that same level, because it'll be it'll be new, but people will yearn for a structure that they can sit themselves in and kind of just turn their head when something comes at them and says, are we for this? Do we like this? Do we not? We don't. All right, then. I don't like it, because it will provide stability. But of course, because again, it's not sexy to look at these things from historical movements, but it is incredibly stabilizing. I'm a very middle of the road, stable person, because what happens is, where that's going to end up, right? What happens when people move toward purely institutionalized religion? We've been here before.
Yes.
What is going to be the rubber band snap there? People are going to elevate. People are going to, let me say this just right. People are going to begin to use that institution as a means of trying to gain power, authority, and righteousness.
The Crusades.
Absolutely. We think these things because we learn from history. We think, we have that wonderful saying, those who don't learn from history repeat it, right?
Yeah.
Oh boy, I got some bad news for you. It's going to repeat anyway.
Yeah.
Even if you learn it. And it's because the human being doesn't change, I think, as much as we think it does. Not a lot. It's very nuanced depending on these new movements. But could we absolutely get another kind of or type of crusade in neo-romanticism? Absolutely. By the end of it, I think that'll probably be the fall of neo-romanticism will be because of that.
God, that's fascinating. I love that. And when I think of that, it puts everything into a bigger picture, which is that, it's kind of like what you said earlier, right? History doesn't care about you or me. It doesn't. And so this is why I draw on Eastern philosophies a lot of times. Like you were talking about this shifting left and right, putting your faith in something up there so that you can withstand it. That's why I like the Eastern philosophies, especially things like Tao and Zen, because it's like, it is what it is, right? I'm here for this limited time. And what do I want to do with it, right? What do I want to believe while I'm here? What am I going to do while I'm here? And it always takes me back to that famous Zen, saying, which is, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And for me, this is very personal, and this is honestly, this really goes to your point, which is that just a year ago, I was a very spiritual person. Like after I got over this bout of PTSD I had from being in the war, trying psychedelics, I was in a very spiritual place. And I was just like, man, I want to save the world. I want to help people. Quickly, I realized that I was born here in the United States, in the West, right? If I'm wearing monk's robes and going to a monastery and shaving my hair off and stuff, people probably aren't going to listen to me that much, because right now, that is not what anybody wants. Right now, the way that we are going to change the world, people like you and I, is through academics. The Zen masters of Japan and the gurus of India are the psychologists, the professors, and the philosophers of the West. We're all speaking the same thing. We're just talking in two different languages. So I've had to change my tone. I still believe in these things, these spiritual things, but I recognize that if I really want to do anything to help the world or help our society, I have to do it through this form of communication. Doesn't take anything away from the other people. It's just a matter of how are you saying it? What are you saying? But in the end, that only for me is doing what makes me happy, right? Reading books and talking about philosophy. I might change or help some people, but really that's up to history. That's up to the way that humans are. That ultimately I'm not changing anything, right? Even Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, they had, even though they had a big impact, that's still, right? Still didn't change the whole world, right? It has limitations. And as good as we want to be and as much as we want to do things, it's just really not up to us, right? Which is what I think you're saying about this kind of putting all of that into something else. And it's beautiful. It's all poetry, right? In the end, it's all poetry. And I think that is more of like the romanticism that you're kind of speaking to. And I hope that is where we're going to, because that would be something spectacular to see an American revolution into a romanticism where people are talking like the early transcendentalists were.
And I think I will say this. I think it'll be an easier movement to live in than the contentiousness that we have now in our discussion. Won't be perfect, because no movement ever is.
Right.
There'll be major problems, there'll be minor problems, all of that stuff that's in between as well. What I would say is, what I'm going to key in on that you said, you mentioned, what can I do? My motto, is, if you want to push back against neo-modernism and the negativity of it, we have the model for how to do it from modernism, what it kind of is modeled after. For your audience, if you're familiar with the short story "A Good Man Is Hard to Find" by Flannery O'Connor, okay, there's a character in it called the Misfit, which is kind of the main evil kind of entity of the story, and it's just a man. That's it. But it's one of the most frightening figures in all of literature. And why? Because when the grandmother is saying to him kind of something like, there must be some good in you, in a very modern way, he kind of simply says, nope, there's nothing left to do in the world but do some hate, do some evil. And that is a little bit of what we see today, is this idea of, because we're so starved for meaningful narratives, for any kind of sacredness, for any kind of things that can take us out of this mundane world of clicks and bytes and all this other stuff, we have a very real problem of falling into becoming misfits by the tail end of this, where we
Yes.
find that there is nothing left that has any meaning in the world except to do a little bit of evil, because we can then assert ourselves on someone else and really ruin their lives. And let's not pretend like there isn't a feeling that comes with that. And that's my greatest concern, is that we end up, we think it's bad now. No, it's not. We could devolve into this kind of misfit community in the Flannery O'Connor sense.
Yeah.
And it's that, to me, is the most frightening. So if you want to push back against neo-modernism and really make a difference, do good.
Yeah.
Don't just, I mean, but you have to begin, and I'll tell my students this as well, before you can know what good is, right? Because the postmodern thought is, well, what is good, right? Everything is an individual perspective in postmodernism. Your good is not the same as mine. Stop it. Stop. We've known for a long time, right? We've put in the work. We've had lives lost. We've had we have bloodshed for this question. Sit down for 5 minutes, turn your phone off, and write down for yourself, what does good mean? What does it look like? What does it do? And then, you know what? Go out there right after you do that and just do one good thing. You're not going to do it every day. You're not. But if you want to push back against this, be kind, be good to people at times, and create good for someone else, or you run the risk of becoming this neo-modern misfit.
That was honestly wonderfully said. You know, it's not as it's not as you said, it's not as sexy as the reference you made. But if you think about The Dark Knight, the movie with the Joker, Heath Ledger's Joker, he says, he's talking to Alfred, right? What does Alfred say? Some men just want to watch the world burn, right? It's actually interesting we're talking about this. I was on an online event last night, a philosophy chat with some other people, and one person in there, you know, they were very argumentative. Every single thing that anyone said, they were argumentative to. And then when it finally got to the bottom line, this person said, I want to see all of this end. And so somebody challenged him, and they were like, well, what do you mean? And he's like, I want to see all of this, humans. I want to see all of us end. And then that led into the conversation. Well, why? And he said, because we're a parasite to this planet. We're a cancer to this planet, right? And he's not the only one. There are people who think this, and that is exactly what you're talking about, right? Because if you're there, then unspeakable acts are not too far away, right? Think about the people at Columbine, right? The kids of Columbine. That was very similar to their way of thinking, right? Humans are the problem. We're a parasite. We're this. When you've gotten to that place, there just really isn't anywhere left for you to go. And that is somebody like that. I do think that is somebody who needs a little bit of this, something up there, right? They need that. And, you know, I think that to caveat what you're saying, that is what I'm scared of, is that people are heading this direction. People are so tired of talking to each other. People are so tired of being alive. So tired of politics, so tired of COVID, that is the direction that people are willing to head, because they just don't have anything left in them to carry on. Not to be too cynical, but
no, it's not. I don't think that's, I mean, cynicism is my worst enemy. I try to push back against cynicism any chance that I get, period. I hate it. Cynicism is just, there's no place for it. It doesn't lead anyone anywhere good. Quite honestly, it doesn't. You have to believe in the human spirit and goodness. For someone like Tolkien with Lord of the Rings, right? Tolkien lived through modernism and made his way into postmodernism. And those stories, right, whether it's the Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, Silmarillion, right, these ideas, that the reason why those stories stay with us is because they mark that time so well. What can we do against such hatred is asked, right? And in the movie, and I reread the Lord of the Rings like 2 years ago, but I always mix up what's in the movie, what's in the book, always still. But in the movie part, at least, you have two parts that I always stick to. And I try to rewatch the trilogy at least once a year for my own rebirth into humanity again. Because you have one, the king at one point in the second movie, The Tower, says, "What can we men do against such reckless hate?" And Aragorn says, "Ride out with me. Meet it." That's not the same thing as saying, "Let's go beat it. Let's go win." It's, let's you and I go out there together. And that seems so antagonistic to what we want to be today, which is my story, my channel, my word, my this and that. We're very much inward focused on building our own narratives, that we've forgotten the true essence of humanity, and the beauty of it is when we're together to fight back and push back against things that are dark, foreboding, right? And the other thing is this: you have that one element in the story of ride out together, but then you have the Samwise part of this, which is necessary for us individually. So the whole time that Sam and Frodo are going through, this quest to bring this ring back, Frodo is losing more and more a part of his humanity, which happens to us, doesn't it?
Yes.
Right? Life just pulls at us all the time and tries to take us not down all at once. It pulls little bits of us until we reach that certain point in life where we go, you know what? I hate everything now. What am I supposed to do? What does Sam do? Sam stops his friend and he reminds him, you keep going because there is good in the world and you have to fight for it. And so what I would tell people today is to always carry that with you. The idea that you have to fight for this. And sometimes the best way to do that is when you are feeling at your worst. That's when you actually have to go out and do something good for someone else, because you're not going to make yourself happy. It's not going to happen. The best thing you can do is try to go out and make someone else's day a little bit better. And at the end of that event, whatever you do, even something as simple as sitting down and saying, how are you doing? You probably will feel a little bit better about yourself, because it'll build that beauty of the world back into you.
Yeah. Honestly, yeah, I think that we need a stronger, you said a lot about people are focusing on me, and we need a sense of us. We need a sense of community.
But it's got to be bigger, Cameron. It's got to be bigger than the stuff that we talk about today. I'm going to be honest with you. We talk a lot about these topics that are big in society. We think they're big, but you know what? The big stuff are the things that have been discussed since the very beginning. Oftentimes I'll tell my students, and they all have opinions on this and that, but I'll confound them when I simply ask them, are you good? Are you good? And I do this, and what ends up happening is the first person I ask will go, I don't know. And then I'll ask the next student, are you good? And that student will invariably feel pressure to say something. And so they'll say something like, I think so. When I get to the third student, almost invariably, this happens the same way in every class. The third student will say, yes, in a very defiant sort of like, I want to do this. But it's the next question that stumps them. How do you know? And that comes back to the idea that our heads are being filled up all the time with nonsense stuff and avoiding the big questions that have been around forever. Certainly that the ancient Greeks were trying to struggle with, and Eastern philosophies have done a good job of struggling with this too. What is beauty? What is good? What is evil? How can you talk about these things and judge them if you've never sat down and actually tried to define them for yourself? That's the stuff that I'm interested in. And I'll get looks sometimes like, nah, who cares about that stuff? That stuff's, useless. No. I'm sorry. That's actually the important stuff. Because if you can build a foundation of humanity based on what is good, what is evil, what is beauty, right? Ethics, what are ethics? What does that even mean? What is justice? I'm sorry, but guess what? You're not treating people like garbage like we do. If you make it your life goal to try to understand these larger concepts that actually make up humanity, you're not interested in getting drawn into these conversations of today's buzzwords.
Definitely. It's the most important. That's the single most important thing, right? Because if we did that, if we cared enough to do that, then all these other things, they would fall by the wayside, because that's right there, what you just said there. Peter Boland and I talked about meaning, and we talked about, like, I talked about virtues. We were talking about why do you have them. People who are religious have a reason to have virtues, because they're trying to please God, or trying to be in favor with God, or not trying to piss off God. And then people who don't have a religious moral ground to stand on, it's a little bit harder for them, because they have to find a reason to do that. But what you just said there, that can be the reason for anyone, religious or non-religious. That right there is what you can base your virtues and your morals on. I think
What does it mean to be a human?
Yeah.
What does it mean? Because if you define that and you really think about it, don't just react. Think about what it means to be human. Then when you're confronted with a situation of a difficult, conversation of any number of these buzzwords that we like to throw around today, you're armed with humanity. And so you sit there and you go, what would be the humane thing to do? I can stand on that. I can. And you'll feel better, I think, about the world around you, right? Because when I see sometimes people who are, yelling at me, I just kind of sit there sometimes and I go, I'm kind of sad for you, actually. Yeah. Like I feel bad that you think so little of humanity, that you feel like you feel like it is going to make you feel better, actually, to tear me down for some reason, right? Like, that's just kind of sad. I'm just sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel the same way. And I think all of that, I keep, it's funny, as I keep thinking that this is a good place to end. And then you keep saying stuff. I'm like, damn, I want to add to that. And this, for me, what you're just saying there, right? When we're talking about these people who want to see the world burn, right? It's trauma, right? Mm-hmm. They've been hurt, right? They've been hurt, and they haven't found a way to reconcile with that. They don't have the tools, right? And honestly, this is for anybody that's, here we go. This is me dropping it now. This is basically the premise of my next book, is this idea. I'm creating a method, a 3-step method for people who want to reconcile those things, right? And I personally believe that there's 3 things that humanity can do for themselves, right? This doesn't need religion. This doesn't need philosophy. This is just what you talked about, right? This idea of, like, what is good, what is bad. There are 3 things that we can do. That is loving ourselves, right? Because it's going to be really hard to love other people if you don't even love yourself. And if you can do that, if you love yourself, it makes it easier to love others, to have a sense of compassion. If you don't have that, if you don't have compassion for yourself, why would you ever give a shit about anyone else, right? And if you can find that, if you can find compassion, then it makes it really easy to forgive people, right? Those 3 things are what we are lacking, right? Probably you could say we've always lacked them. We go through periods where we have it and we don't, and we have it and we don't. Right now, we don't have it. And there's not a good enough reason. There can be, but right now there's not a good enough reason for people to reconcile that within themselves. And I think that could be the catalyst for moving into this idea of this romantic era that we could be in, this revolution. Because if you can love yourself, love others, and forgive them, then whenever you see shit on social media, you can just be like, I don't care. I don't like this. You're going to be more likely to go outside. And when you see people, you're going to smile, make eye contact. You're going to be more likely to do these good things that you're talking about, buying somebody a meal, right? Sending somebody a Christmas card that's not just in your family. And what I've always said is you have to have a reason to want to do that, whether it's religion, whether it's virtuous, whatever. That essence right there, that's what we need more so.
Yeah. And I'll just end, I'll I know you want to draw this down. I'll just end my part by saying those concepts, compassion and love, right? people will deride you for that, and they will say, oh, that's hokey. And I would simply say, oh man, are you wrong?
Yes.
I mean, you are so wrong. The stuff that we talk about today, we're going to know in 100 years, people will look back and they will say, you know what? If they had instead talked about it from the standpoint of humanity, compassion, love, mercy, forgiveness, any number of these concepts, if you deal with those larger concepts, you don't even need these other conversations that we're having today. What you need to do is make adjustments, which we will always do as a species, is make certain adjustments under the umbrella of these things. But those large concepts of humanity, if you don't deal with these in some way, I guarantee you, you might find yourself at the end of all of this as a misfit.
This has been honestly one of my favorite conversations. This has been really good. Dr. Meyer, do you have anything you want to plug? Is there, if people want to get to know you better, or maybe listen to your podcast or read some of your work, where can people find you?
Sure. You can go to the neutralgroundpodcast.com. That's kind of the main hub. I'm on Apple, though. I'm on Spotify, even YouTube slowly, with a channel. My whole goal is to have meaningful conversations without extremes. It's that kind of unsexy, let's get in the middle on neutral ground here, but let's actually create meaning. And I'll talk about things. I'll have people who talk about academic work, and I'll have people who just talk about, who are just interesting, and we can have meaningful discussions. I had Dr. Alex Hershaft, who is a Holocaust survivor, a wonderful, amazing man, amazing stories. So it's not just academic stuff, although I have that sometimes. It's just about meaningful conversation. That's it. And if you're tired of, kind of like what we had today, if you just want to get somewhere with a good conversation, check it out, the neutralgroundpodcast.com.
Excellent. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon again. I've got some more good stuff lined up. Thanks for listening. This has been Hermit Radio.